Hello my dear listener and welcome to our channel. Jonathan Fremont had just gotten home from working his 8-hour shift plus an additional 4 hours of overtime. Jonathan worked as a diesel mechanic for the Caterpillar dealership in town. He wasn't a foreman, but he was one of their top mechanics. Jonathan was content not being a foreman, he preferred to focus on his work. Things had been extremely busy with fire crews out on several major forest fires, plus countless smaller blazes popping up. Equipment had been breaking down everywhere, and Jonathan was needed almost around the clock. Since mid-July, Jonathan had been working overtime, and it was now nearing the time for the children to start back to school at the end of August. Jonathan had been rising early and coming home late, throughout the summer, weekdays and weekends. Not that Jonathan was complaining, he was happy with the overtime. It meant extra money, which was crucial for the expensive 4-bedroom, 2.5-bath ranch house with a 2-car garage that Jonathan and Susan had bought 2 years ago. Cindy, Joey, and Nancy weren't little anymore, they needed their own rooms and their own space. With all the fires burning out of control, Jonathan was bringing home substantial paychecks. Although he was bone-tired, the financial stability was worth it. Jonathan felt good knowing he was a good provider for his family. He loved them dearly and was proud of them. If anyone had asked, he would have said he had the best wife and children anyone could ask for. Of course, like any couple, they had their small issues. Susan had gained a bit of weight after having the 3 kids, and Jonathan had developed a beer gut. Susan often complained about Jonathan not wanting to attend social gatherings or parties, preferring to stay home or go fishing instead. Their intimacy wasn't as fulfilling as either of them would have liked. Jonathan wanted more excitement, while Susan desired more affection and attention. These were just small irritations that didn't warrant serious arguments, and they managed to overlook them. When Jonathan walked into the house, everything seemed unusually quiet. Normally, he would hear the sounds of the children playing. It was still too early for them to be in bed, and it was too late for them to be out at the neighbor's house. Jonathan wondered if he had forgotten something. Perhaps Susan had mentioned they were staying somewhere else, like with their grandparents. But Susan was there, sitting alone at the dining room table, her hands folded on the tabletop, staring at Jonathan with a pensive and troubled expression. Jonathan noticed that Susan's eyes were red, as though she had been crying. Her first words were, "Jonathan, there's something we need to talk about." Her gaze shifted from Jonathan to her hands. Jonathan felt a pang of anxiety and sadness, as the look on Susan's face reminded him of a past distressing moment, the day she had told him about his father's sudden death. Feeling weak, Jonathan sat down across from Susan, unable to find words. He could only look at her questioningly, but Susan avoided his gaze. She seemed distant and reluctant to speak, caught in a moment of hesitation. Jonathan sensed that Susan was struggling with her words, not wanting to have this conversation but unable to avoid it. Susan finally spoke, her tone heavy with sorrow. "Jonathan, you know I love you. You know I love you more than any man in the world. You know you mean the world to me, don't you?" Jonathan swallowed hard, his mouth dry, too dry to speak. "Yes." Susan raised her eyes to Jonathan, studying his face for more of an answer than just that one simple word. "You need to believe that now more than ever before. Jonathan, I need to tell you about some things that make this very important. You need to know how much I truly do love you, how important you are to me, how important we are to each other. You have to believe in us. You just have to, no matter how you feel afterwards, no matter how much you feel hurt. This is important now more than ever before. I truly do love you." Susan's voice was quaking, those last words spoken each as if they were single sentences. Jonathan had cold sweat dripping down his back, his hands beginning to shake. He could not believe his own thoughts, anticipation and Susan's words, her mood and facial expression. The whole atmosphere had Jonathan's mind racing to 1,000 different conclusions. He could not force the memories of his father's death out of his mind, out of his awareness and feelings. They pervaded his entire being. Intuitively, Jonathan knew that this was one of those moments that change everything. Whatever Susan wanted to tell him, life would never be the same afterward. For moments, time seemed to stand still. Susan sat contemplating Jonathan, but still, her eyes would not meet his. Questioning, puzzled stares only and thoughts stared blankly at Jonathan. Only the clock ticking on the wall broke the silence in the room. You could almost hear the house creaking in the quiet stillness. Then, like the snapping crack of bullets shot from a gun breaking the silence, her words came, rambling and rolling, sometimes soft and barely audible, sometimes hard, loud, almost violent with passion. Her voice was quaky, her lips quivering. I'm not only afraid of you hearing this from someone else and not understanding. I need to tell you this for myself, for my own peace of mind. I can't go on like this anymore. I've carried this with me too long. For over a year now, I've wanted to tell you. I just can't hold it in any longer. Keeping it from you, it's not right. It hurts hiding it, and it's making it feel all wrong. It shouldn't be that way. This is too important, too precious a time for me. We've discussed this over and over now too long. We've decided to tell you. There's no other way. If I don't tell you and don't explain, there's no way that you would or could understand. If you would find out, hear this from someone else, you could only think badly. You would react foolishly and only hurt yourself and me, hurt us, you and I. I don't want you misunderstanding. You need to understand. We need to discuss this openly and honestly so that you can understand. I can only hope, no, pray, that you will love me enough to be able to understand. If you don't, I don't know. I just don't know. I guess I just need to trust and have faith in you and in your love for me. I have to be consequential. There is no other way. She sighed and her shoulders dropped in resignation of whatever would come. Yet for moments, only the ticking of the clock could be heard. Susan did not continue but only stared contemplatively, her hands, her shoulders still bowed in resignation. Once, twice, 3 times, Susan raised her head, opening her mouth to speak but then dropped her head and spoke no words. Finally, painstakingly, as if each word had to be torn from her, she said, Jonathan, this last year I've been seeing someone, a man. Her eyes were now staring intently into Jonathan's, not only awaiting his reaction but also daring, challenging, combative and defensive. She was now ready to defend her actions openly and honestly before Jonathan. Her first baby steps had been taken, now she could no longer hide. Jonathan, he's a very nice, kind, caring, understanding man who has been hurt very badly and needs my love, attention, and care. The year before I met him, he lost his wife in an accident. She died when their car overturned on the highway. He was driving, and even though it wasn't his fault, he blamed himself terribly. He was suffering from heavy, suicidal depression. Even now, after all this time, with all my love and care, he still is depressed at times. Jonathan felt dizzy. Had he heard her correctly? She was seeing someone else. He felt as if he had been struck numb by a single punch and was so out of it that he couldn't even feel the pain. The saliva in his mouth now turned into gummy sludge, still not fully grasping the depth of Susan's words. You're telling me that for the last year you have been seeing someone else? You've been running around with another man? You're telling me that you've thrown away our marriage and our vows just for this? You don't care enough about the kids or me, you just wanted to have your thrills, your fun, your excitement? Susan's eyes flared, burning with anger. Her face was hard and harsh, and her voice rose, shaking with emotion. Jonathan, shame on you. Do you think so little of me? Do you love me so little that you think I am some kind of loose woman, a harlot, or someone wandering the streets right now? I'm so ashamed of you for thinking you could care and love me so little. I'm so disappointed. I don't think I've ever been more disappointed in you before. How could you ever think something like that of me, your own wife and the mother of your children? You're supposed to love, honor, and cherish me. Those were our wedding vows, Jonathan. Susan snapped those last 2 sentences out, intending each word as a slap in Jonathan's face. Then she stopped, her face turning to one side as she attempted to calm herself. For a while, nothing was said. Susan's eyes conveyed emotions of love and consideration, a small sigh of remembered joy and passion passing her lips. Believe me, he's not a bad man, Jonathan. This isn't about what you're thinking or worrying about. This isn't about just physical intimacy or running around uncaringly. This is about love and caring deeply for someone. This is about me helping and giving something of myself that he needs very badly, something that he can't do without. It's about receiving something in return that is very precious to me, something I can hold in my heart and memories when I'm old, ugly, and gray. Something for when no one else loves, wants, or needs me anymore. Yes, there is physical intimacy, and it is good. Sometimes it's even great, but it's not just about that. It's about love and being attentive to the needs and desires of those you care about. That's why the physical aspect is so fulfilling. Jonathan's body buckled in his seat, his stomach cramping from the emotional blow. His awareness centered only on that one thought: Susan loved this man, and she was going to leave him for him. He was losing her to another person. Had she already packed her bags, or maybe packed Jonathan's? Tears formed in his eyes as he bent forward in pain, barely able to look into Susan's eyes. "You love him," was all his body, his voice, and his mind allowed him to express. The pain was evident in his body language and the thoughts in his eyes. Susan understood that this was why she had taken this agonizing step, knowing Jonathan would misunderstand and respond poorly. Yet still, Susan answered honestly and proudly. "Yes, I do love him. I love him very much. He is very important to me, and he means a lot to me. But I love you too. I've never stopped loving you, and I never want to stop loving you. I just love you both differently, for different reasons." Looking forcefully and deeply into Jonathan's eyes, she continued, "I'm never going to leave you for him or anyone else. Jonathan, please never think that. You are my husband, the father of my children, and the love of my life. My soulmate." With a sorrowful sigh, looking out the window into the infinite beyond, she added, "Someday, I know it will be over between him and me. He is too young for me to consider as a long-term partner. In time, he will grow past his need for me and find someone who will become his soulmate and partner. Then I will step aside, cherishing only our memories." Jonathan, now gasping for breath, felt rage building up within him. "Who is he? Where's this person?" he demanded. Jonathan stood up from his chair, pacing between the kitchen and the dining room. Susan's eyes and face were cold, ever so cold, severe, and insensitive. "Who he is none of your concern or business. What we do, how we care for each other, and when we do it, is between him and me. You are not a part of that. Just as he is not a part of our life together. Never ask me such questions again. I will not answer you." Jonathan slammed his fist against the wall, the plasterboard cracking underneath his fist. "How in the hell could you ever think that I would accept such a situation? Are you crazy? Do you seriously expect me to willingly share you with this person?" Susan's cold, severe, and insensitive expression now grew into a mocking smile. "What are you going to do, Jonathan, divorce me?" "I don't think so. Do you know what a divorce would mean for you? Maybe you should check out your options with a lawyer before you go spouting off any more nonsense. This is a no-fault divorce state, Jonathan. He's a divorce lawyer, so we know very well the outcome. We've discussed this completely. If you divorce me now, Jonathan, I will take you to the cleaners. I will protect my children and me first and foremost. Your welfare will not be a concern of mine. You would be paying me alimony, court costs, my car payment, and for this house. With the amount of overtime you've been working lately, you wouldn't be able to afford anything but a cardboard box to live in. You'd be sleeping in your car or at work and eating basic meals for at least the next 10 to 12 years. Susan's expression softened slightly but remained formidable, her body leaning aggressively forward off the back of her chair and over the table. "Have you given the children any thought? How would they fit into your plans? Do you know how our divorce would affect them? Have you considered what impact your absence would have on them?" Leaning back into her chair, crossing her arms and laying her hands on her upper arms, the mocking smile returned to her lips. "No, Jonathan, divorce is not an option." Realizing how bitterly Susan had stacked the deck against him, Jonathan felt the need to at least gain some leverage. "What if I were to cheat on you? How would you feel about that? Wouldn't that be fair?" Susan responded quickly, too quickly to have not already considered the option. "Don't be so foolish, Jonathan. Take a good look at yourself. You're not young anymore. You're balding, and your belly is starting to hang over your belt. You're a middle-aged man with 3 children and a wife to support. Who would even consider having an affair with someone like you? Women our age want sincerity, comfort, compassion, and security, or they seek men who can offer new and exciting experiences. None of those things can you provide. If you go out chasing other women and embarrass and shame me, I will divorce you." For long moments, they stared angrily at each other. It was Susan's eyes that first broke the tension. She turned her head toward the window, gazing into the distance. Time slowly passed in silence, with only the ticking of the clock and Jonathan's heavy breathing filling the quiet. Gradually, Susan's attention turned back to Jonathan. Her eyes were no longer cold and harsh but soft, tender, and loving. "Jonathan, this doesn't have to be this way. My love for you hasn't changed. I am still your loving wife, just as I always was. He hasn't taken anything from you, not a single thing. I am still here for you and always will be." Susan continued, "If you love me enough, what's between him and me should not change our love for each other. Maybe, with time, our love can even grow stronger because of this. Everything that happens now between us is up to you. I'm still open to you. I'm trying to rebuild our connection. I hope that if you love me enough, you would understand what this means to me and be happy for me." Tears started forming in her eyes as she looked back at Jonathan, her expression almost questioning and begging. "I don't know what else I can say or tell you. I only thought your love for me would be strong enough to look past your own hurt and want the best for me. I'm sorry if you can't do that. I'm very sorry." She sobbed, covering her mouth with her hand, and ran from the dining room down the hall toward the bedroom. The door slammed behind her. Jonathan stiffly walked into the kitchen, pulled out a bottle of Jim Beam, and moved back into the dining room. He tipped the bottle up and drank deeply, letting the whiskey flow down his throat in heavy gulps. Sitting back in the chair he had occupied before, he stared at the corner where Susan had been sitting, lifting the open bottle in a mock toast. "Here's to my loving wife, here's to my loving adulterous wife." With the bottle pressed to his lips, he took another 3 heavy gulps of whiskey. Jonathan, who normally never got drunk with anger, was finding himself increasingly consumed by both rage and depression. As he drank more, his anger and depressive thoughts grew more intense. At one point, he staggered toward the closed bedroom door, which was locked. Slamming his fist against it, he shouted, "God damn it, Susan. Not only are you with someone else, but now you're locking me out of my own bedroom. I can't even be a man in my own house anymore. You've turned me into someone who isn't allowed to sleep in his own bed. What's next? Are you going to have him here, in our bed, in my place? Is that your next move, or has it already happened?" Jonathan staggered back into the dining room, but not before shouting once more, "Susan, you're something else. I hope you know I never should have married you." About half an hour later, Susan walked out of the bedroom, dressed and carrying a small overnight case of clothing. She intended to leave without stopping, but she paused for a moment, looking at Jonathan with pity. He was completely inebriated, his head resting on the table, the bottle of Jim Beam mostly empty and tipped over in front of him. As she was about to leave, Jonathan raised his head briefly and asked, "Are you going to your lover?" Susan did not answer immediately but turned and walked toward the door. "Yes, Jonathan, I am going to him tonight. You're so angry and drunk that I'm afraid of what you might do. You've said enough cruel things to last me a lifetime. If I hear any more, I might learn to hate you. I only hope that tomorrow you'll think differently and that we can talk." Jonathan slept for a time and then awoke, reaching for the bottle again. He fell back asleep, but during the night, he woke up feeling halfway sober. He stumbled into the bedroom, sitting on the bed, feeling utterly alone. The full impact of the previous evening hit him, and he cried hysterically, the sobs seeming to go on endlessly. The next morning, Jonathan was hungover and unable to work. He called in sick for the first time in ages and told his boss he was taking not only his sick leave days but also a week's vacation. When his boss became indignant, Jonathan simply replied, "I don't care if you don't like it. Fire me if you want." He hung up the phone while his boss was still arguing. Mumbling to himself, he said, "As if it matters. If I don't work for them, I'll work for someone else." Wandering around the empty house, Jonathan knew he should be doing something, reacting, and figuring out the next steps. He needed to find out facts for himself, not just accept what Susan had told him. How am I going to find a lawyer? With my luck, I'd end up calling her new partner. He searched through the phone book and found a female lawyer, hoping this would eliminate the possibility of any conflict. Staring at the phone, he hesitated, feeling a sense of finality with that simple act of dialing. If he called this lawyer, he would be putting everything he had worked for, his house, his marriage, his hopes for the future, behind him. His thoughts kept wandering, trying to convince himself that this wasn't true, that it wasn't happening. There had to be a simple explanation for everything that had happened. Jonathan wanted so badly for the previous day to be erased from his mind. He questioned whether it would have been better if Susan had never told him. Perhaps they could have continued as they were. Memories flooded back to him, his firstborn child handed to him in the hospital, their first date, her just out of high school, and their first time together. He wondered if there was something he could do, should have done, or if he should simply accept what's left. Reaching for the phone, he decided that whatever happens, he needed to know. He couldn't let things continue as they had. He would call for advice first. He didn't have to make any decisions yet. The appointment was set for the next morning, and he was asked to bring all financial papers, tax returns, etc. Taking a couple of aspirin, he stepped into the shower, letting the warm water ease his headache. When he returned to the bedroom, he noticed the voicemail recorder was lit, indicating someone had called while he was lost in thought and showering. He hadn't heard the phone ring. "Jonathan, it's me. I'm at my parents' place, picking up the kids. I'm going to take them to my sister's for a day or so. That should give us both some time to think. I only told Mom and Dad that we had an argument, so there's no need to involve anyone else. I know we both said some harsh things last night, things that should not have been said, or at least not in that manner. Please believe me, it's not as bad as you're thinking. I truly do love you, and we can get through this if we want to. I'm sorry I sounded so harsh and hurtful last night. I didn't mean to be. I was just too nervous and afraid." Abruptly, the tape ended. He spent the rest of the day searching for financial records and pondering how someone could profess to love two people at the same time. He couldn't understand or grasp the concept. He knew he loved people differently, friends, family, his wife, children, mother, and father, but how could someone emotionally and physically love two different people simultaneously? Was he missing something? Could she be right in some way? Was this situation unique and unusual? Was he being too judgmental? Did she love him, or was she just infatuated with someone else, craving something that he couldn't provide? The pain knotted in his gut. She had a life away from him, foreign to him, a life he wasn't a part of, a life he could not offer. After the pain and fear came hate and anger, followed by self-doubt. How had he failed her? What had changed them? He recalled her words about how he had changed. He didn't feel different, but then again, maybe he was. Walking into the bedroom, he stared at himself in the full-length mirror, wondering when all these changes had happened and why he hadn't noticed them. His thoughts grew darker. Had he changed? Was he not the man she married? They had been living off memories for too long. He had left her emotionally before she physically left him. Did she love her new partner because he was the man Jonathan used to be? Was this just about winning her back from him? Why was he always at fault? It wasn't fair. She wasn't the same person he married either. Wasn't there supposed to be some kind of equality? She had cheated. He hadn't forced her into anything. He was the one being hurt. Lost in erratic thoughts, his mind wandered into deeper, darker passages. He thought about her with her new partner, and she had said their intimacy was fulfilling. Did that mean her new partner was better than him? Did she experience things with him that she never did with Jonathan? The jealousy was painful but also oddly mixed with a morbid curiosity. He felt sick with fear, hurt, and jealousy, yet also strangely intrigued. His arousal seemed fueled by his self-doubt and jealousy. He needed to know every detail about their relationship, but he struggled to break free from his own negative thoughts. He wanted to return to the righteous anger he had felt before, when her actions had wronged him in his marriage. He felt innocent, yet self-doubt gnawed at him. Susan drove along the state highway, up into the mountains above their city. The children were quiet, looking forward to visiting Aunt Jenny and Uncle Joe. Jenny and Joe lived in a remote mountain home, far from neighbors but with plenty of animals and adventures to occupy the children's time. They had no children of their own, so the visits from their nieces and nephews were always welcomed. Susan knew that once they arrived, the children would be well cared for, and she'd have time to think her own thoughts. After a night's rest, Susan deeply regretted how her conversation with Jonathan had gone. She was ashamed of the role she had played. She hadn't wanted to say things the way she did. None of the talks had gone as planned. She had reacted to his anger with her own, and in doing so, had hurt him more than she intended. She had planned to keep the details of her sexual relationship with Rich to herself, only acknowledging its existence. Yet, she knew that she was the one who had initially described their encounters in detail, potentially causing Rich unnecessary pain, possibly even hurting him beyond repair. Reflecting on this, she realized she should never have shared those intimate details. It was a mistake, an outright wrong one. As she drove up the meandering road, her mind wandered to her conflicting emotions regarding her sexual relationships with both men. Morally, she understood that being involved with two men was wrong, yet it felt so right at times. Initially, with Rich, she had felt a sense of wrongdoing, an illicit thrill similar to her teenage years, but that feeling had faded over time. Their relationship had evolved, becoming a space where they explored their desires more freely and adventurously. The experiences with Rich were different, more liberated and wild compared to her relationship with her husband. There were things she did with Rich that she could never imagine doing with her husband, mainly because her relationship with Rich was temporary, unbound by the same commitments. She didn't feel the moral constraints of her upbringing in her time with Rich. She could openly discuss her fantasies with him, something she would never dare share with her husband. Yet, it wasn't just the physical aspect of their encounters that made them so compelling. During their intimate moments, her thoughts often intertwined the images of both men, merging them into one experience. She wished she could combine the qualities of both men, Jonathan's strength and stability with Rich's kindness and understanding, into a single ideal partner. Jonathan provided her with a dependable, solid foundation, while Rich offered gentleness, compassion, and openness. Initially, guilt had overwhelmed her, leading her to end their relationship twice. She returned to Rich after he had attempted suicide, and again when she unexpectedly met him while shopping and saw his deep despair. She couldn't resist, succumbing to the emotional pull and re-entering their complicated dynamic. Their relationship had started innocently at a house party where her husband refused to attend. They had only talked then, and she noticed his depressed state. Their conversations, revealing his emotional suffering, seemed to uplift him, and he found solace in her presence. This sense of being needed and valued was something she cherished, contrasting sharply with her routine life as a housewife and mother. They continued meeting and talking for a long time after the party. Initially, their interactions were limited to phone calls, and later, they met at cafes and restaurants during the day while her husband was at work and the children were at school. Their time together was non-sexual, focusing on building a close friendship where they shared their hopes, worries, and concerns. Before the accident, he had worked as a paralegal. The settlement from the car manufacturer's insurance company was a multi-million-dollar amount. With the money and time spent in the hospital, he had abandoned his attempts at working. Through their talks, she managed to persuade him to return to college and study law. Their relationship gradually shifted from phone conversations and lunches to her visiting him at his house in a sisterly manner, with the intention of cooking him a home-cooked meal. Though the initial visits and meals didn't seem to change their relationship much, over time, she began visiting him more frequently, spending less time with him in town. She took on the role of managing his disorganized household, which brought them closer. Unbeknownst to her, she often associated her behavior towards him with her own marriage, blending her feelings and actions between her husband and Rich. As their emotional connection deepened, their conversations increasingly took on a sexual nature. They discussed their desires, fantasies, and past experiences, creating a sexually charged atmosphere between them. It was inevitable that their closeness would lead to physical intimacy. Although they had kissed before, it was after a kiss in the kitchen that day that their passion escalated. They moved fervently to his bedroom, leaving their lunch uncooked on the kitchen counter. After their passionate encounter, she hurriedly dressed and left his house. At home, she had showered while crying, scrubbing vigorously in an attempt to undo what they had done. When he later called, she refused to answer and avoided all contact, shunning places he might go. Plagued with guilt, she promised herself that something like that would never happen again and that it would remain her secret transgression, known only to herself. Yet a week later, hearing the news that he was in the hospital after having taken an overdose of sleeping pills, she felt the weight of her guilt for being at least partially to blame. She visited him, holding his hand, and they quietly promised each other never to be intimate again. But that was an empty promise. Though each felt guilty about their actions, both were too weak to resist, and soon enough, regrets followed. Within days after their final return, she gave up hope of leaving him for a normal life and simply accepted the finality of their affair. Now, walking through the forest surrounding her sister's place and hearing her children laughing and playing, she cried. She had wanted so badly to explain to Jonathan her thoughts and feelings, needing her strong, stable husband's help. She felt trapped by her own actions and didn't know any way out. She had hoped that as husband and wife, they would have been able to talk and find solutions, but he hadn't asked her any questions about her reasoning or feelings. He had only focused on the results. To him, nothing else mattered except that she had been with another man. She had done something dirty and nasty, and why couldn't he understand that it wasn't just about sex? Sex was merely an expression of emotion and an understanding of intimacy. Everything that had happened during their lovemaking had stemmed from the emotions and desires they had for each other. Of course, she was different with Rich than with him. Their emotions towards each other were different from those she had with her husband. She couldn't act the same with her husband because each relationship existed on a different level of intimacy, communication, and understanding. Comparing physical acts of love and expression across different relationships was insulting and demeaning to everyone involved. Everything had gone wrong during their talk. He had reacted angrily and demanded answers, while she had lost control of herself, retaliating in a way she had promised not to. She had brought everything out into the open, and he had never once asked why, nor had he shown any interest in understanding how such a situation could arise. His lack of care and understanding had angered her the most. So, she had lashed out, hurting him where she knew it would impact him the most. It had been wrong, so wrong. Everything that happened afterward only worsened the situation. She wondered how she could possibly make up for the mistakes already made. Jonathan sat, hands folded with fingers entwined, slightly hanging between his open legs as he looked pensively over the solid oak desk towards the older gray-haired lady behind it. She was reading from the forms he had filled out before and those he had brought with him. He wanted to speak, to rush into explaining and telling her everything he needed to say, but her whole aura demanded that he wait. So, impatiently, he did. After finishing her reading, she slowly laid the paperwork aside and looked over her reading glasses toward him. So, please tell me why you are here. What happened to make you decide to divorce your wife? You don't look well. Are you feeling okay? Do you need help? He coughed and said, Yesterday, no, the day before yesterday, my wife told me she's been having an affair for a long time. Geez, I don't know how to say this. It was only a guess. I hadn't gotten used to the thought. This is all new to me. I don't know what to do or what I can do. You're here because you want to know your options. Do you think there isn't any possibility of reconciliation? Her eyes were studying him, questioning him. She stammered in reply, Yes, I need to know my options. And no, I don't know if there's any possibility of reconciliation. She says she still loves me and doesn't want to leave me, but on the other side, she doesn't want to leave him either. It just doesn't sound right. It sounds so wrong. She can't love us both. I need to know my options. Then he told her what his wife had said about how he would fare in a divorce. The lawyer smiled, chuckled, and shook her head while frowning during his telling, allowing him to finish before speaking. Some of what she told you is true. We are in a no-fault divorce state, so the reason for the divorce is irrelevant unless you can prove her to be a criminal, a drug user, dangerously addicted to sex, or incompetent as a mother. Can you? She stared at him, watching him shake his head in response. Also, the children would remain under joint guardianship. She could not, and shouldn't want to, restrict your visitation rights. It is to her and the children's advantage that you involve yourself as much as possible with them. Equity is to be divided between the two of you unless you can prove sources of income through inheritance or similar. Everything would be divided 50-50ths. That includes your house, both cars, and your savings account, everything except personal possessions. Taking a deep breath, she continued, "You've been working too many hours of overtime, which would be to your disadvantage in a divorce. The courts would look at your past earnings history and calculate the amount of child support and alimony you would need to pay. Since she is not working now, or has not been working in the past, and is the mother of 3 small children, the courts would most likely not require her to work until the children are older. You would be paying her alimony. You wouldn't be living in a cardboard box, but you all would suffer financially. Maintaining 2 households is costly and will affect the quality of life for everyone involved, your own, hers, and the children's." Studying him for a moment before continuing, she said, "You could file a suit against her lover for alienation of affection, but since you don't know who he is, and now that everything is out in the open, getting sufficient evidence to prove your case will be extremely difficult. Breaches of privacy are not permissible. If she only visits him at his house, that proves nothing. Any material accumulated from inside his house or without their knowledge and consent would be considered legal snooping and, of course, not admissible in court. So long as they are not misbehaving in public, there is not much that can be done. It's still possible, but, without her willingness to testify in court, I wouldn't recommend pursuing that option either." She then sighed deeply. "In my opinion, I would not advise you to divorce unless there are no other options. I would recommend first counseling for you and your wife." She glanced at the paperwork, seeking his wife's name. "Susan Fremont," she said, before losing her professional demeanor and speaking with concern. "Mr. Fremont, I'm so sorry, but this isn't going to work. I can't help you. It's a matter of confidentiality. I am sorry." Shocked at this turn of events, sitting on the edge of his chair, he asked, "You know her? He works here, doesn't he? Who is he? Where is he asked, off balance but attempting to maintain his composure. She answered, "No, he doesn't work here. He used to work here, as a parallel. We all knew his wife, and we were very touched by her passing. I have met Susan, your wife, only a few times. Jonathan, I can't speak to you as a lawyer, I'm speaking only as an involved person. No one knew she was married. They seemed to fit together so well. She was good for him, and we were all happy for him." She shook her head. "This isn't right. I know him well, he's not the type to chase after married women. I also consider myself a good judge of people, and Susan is not the type to take any relationship lightly. There's more to this than you and I know." Standing up, she walked over to him and touched him on the shoulder. "I know this is all new to you, and you're hurting. But please, consider all of your options. Ask questions and find out the facts before acting. Think about the consequences, not only for yourself and your wife, but also for your children." With that, she handed him her card. "There's my private number on it. If you need to talk to someone, call me. If you don't want to talk with me, I know a good therapist that you might like." As she walked out, he began to think more clearly. Even though not much had been said, and he hadn't found a satisfying solution to his problem, he started to understand that there might never be a perfect solution. The issues created by his wife meant that he would have to navigate some difficult choices, deciding where to fight for what he wanted and where he might need to let go. He realized his biggest mistake was losing control, not losing it, but freely giving it up. He had allowed others to shape his life and had waited for Susan to provide him with meaning and happiness. Yes, he had worked hard, but always towards goals set by others. He had never set his own goals, which had led to a lack of direction and, in some ways, laziness. He had a job, a house, a wife, and children, but he didn't have a life of his own. His hobbies were reduced to fishing, drinking beer, and watching TV. He wasn't even interested in mechanics anymore. Friends, other than coworkers and neighbors, were few, as his old buddies had drifted away. He had let himself go, and she was right, he was getting out of shape and looking like a slob. Then he wondered, if they did break up, what would the consequences be? What would he need to do to protect himself and his interests? What kind of life would he have? He realized he needed to focus on himself, to reclaim his own goals and values. Thinking about Susan, he knew he couldn't deal with her right now. She was too much of a question mark, a stumbling block, and an unknown. He was better off setting their problems aside and dealing with issues he could manage, incorporating her into his plans only when necessary. For his first step into his new life, he visited his boss and laid down an ultimatum. Until further notice, he would not only stop working overtime but would also reduce his hours at the Caterpillar shop to part-time, working just 4 days a week. If a divorce came, he would earn less for a while, but he planned to increase his earnings later if needed. For now, he wanted to invest more time in himself and his interests. His next step took him to the bank, where he cashed in his 401k and their savings account. He then went to another bank and opened new checking and savings accounts in his name alone. He left their joint checking account open for living expenses and bills, but all of his income would first go into his personal accounts. They had only one credit card, which he split into 2 accounts, one in his name with the same limit as before, and the other with both names and a limit set at $600. He intended to maximize his use of the funds before Susan could claim her share from their assets. A day later, when Susan pulled into their driveway, the first thing she noticed was not his 8-year-old Ford pickup but a brand new silver gray Dodge Ram 3/4 ton with a Cummins diesel engine. As she approached, she wondered who was visiting. The kids, excited, yelled, "Hey, Dad, cool truck," but all she heard was hammering coming from the basement. Dropping her bags, she hurried into the kitchen and then down the stairs, leaving her standing alone in the living room, confused. The temporary license taped on the back window and the noise from downstairs told a story. She dropped her bags in the living room and sat down at the dining table with a sigh. The noise below subsided as she waited. Cindy, their oldest, was the first to climb back up the stairs. "Mom, Daddy's fixing up the basement. He says he's going to put in a party room for us and another bedroom and bathroom. He's already got the walls up. Isn't that cool?" Tugging at her mother's hand, Cindy pulled her up from her chair. "Come on, Mom, it's going to be really neat downstairs." Downstairs, she found Jonathan sitting on a pile of wallboard in the new party room. The other 2 children were on each side of him, and he had his arms around Joey and Nancy, laughing and talking with them. He had a sparkle in his eyes and a broad smile on his face. When he saw her, he stopped mid-sentence, and his smile faded. His eyes turned cold. Blushing, she looked away and walked down the hall to inspect the bathroom and the other rooms being created. She was startled by Jonathan's words behind her. "That room can stay as storage, and the room with the bigger window can be for us." They both stood there, acknowledging the change but unable to accept it. "Jonathan, it doesn't have to be this way," she finally whispered. Little Nancy slipped in between them and raised her arms to her father. "Daddy, if Joey can I sleep down here with you sometimes?" Jonathan lifted her up, rubbing his face against hers and holding her close. He breathed in her fresh, soapy scent and gave her a kiss on the cheek. "You sure can, baby doll." Jonathan spent the rest of the day and into the evening working in the basement, only going upstairs when necessary. After the children went to bed, Susan slowly and pensively walked down the steps, seeking Jonathan, who was meandering through rooms cluttered with building materials, still planning his work for the coming days. For what seemed like hours, they stood staring at each other. She wanted to speak first, to open up and try to explain, but in her thoughts and hopes, she still wished he would ask her that one simple question, why? She still hoped he might want to understand. Breaking his contemplation, Jonathan looked around the party room at the expanse of wallboard, lumber, tools, and fixtures haphazardly strewn on the floor. His thoughts wandered to the new pickup parked outside the garage. "You were right, Susan. I let myself go, but my biggest mistake was trusting you with my future and my happiness." With a deep sigh, he dropped his head. "No, maybe it wasn't trust. Maybe it was just laziness. I don't know right now." Raising his head, his eyes cold and glaring into hers, he continued, "But one thing I do know is that this has to end." He gestured around the room and then pointed at his chest. "If all this has taught me anything, it's that from now on, I'm looking out for number 1 first." Holding up 2 fingers close to her face, he glared, anger building within him. "Right now, I've only got 2 interests, me and the children. Neither one of them is you. Susan grimaced slightly and pulled back at his words and the fingers he waved so closely in front of her. Letting his hand fall, he turned from her, the image of her entwined with her lover dragging his thoughts into dark places. He dropped his shoulders in pain. Right now, nothing else matters, he sighed, more to himself than to her. He struggled to shake off thoughts of her with her lover, her passion a stark contrast to what he had known. He raised his head and said, "What you did to me the other night and what you've been doing is unforgivable. Maybe I'm partly responsible for what happened, but that doesn't change the wrong you've done." Turning back to her, his eyes were hard and bitter. "No matter what, you had no right to do this to me." Susan stood silently, her head bent down, eyes to the floor. Neither he nor anyone else could read her emotions. She waited, letting him express his anger and pain. Nothing she could say at that moment would be heard or understood by him. She knew instinctively that this was his moment to express his feelings. Perhaps afterwards, when his anger had cooled, they could talk peacefully and constructively. She promised herself not to repeat the mistakes of that fateful evening. Jonathan continued, pacing back and forth, ticking off the thoughts that had been on his mind. You told me a lot about divorce. If your lover was as smart as you think he is, he should have known better." He glared at her, and Susan, shocked, recoiled slightly, unsure of how much he knew. "You would suffer just as much or more. And not only that, I could get your boy toy into a lot of trouble if I wanted to." The smirk on Jonathan's face was evident as he let her stew about what he knew. "But those aren't my intentions. At least I care about the children." He stopped pacing, glaring at her before continuing. "I'm not going to let you and him control my life or my life with my children." Pointing to the ground, he said, "I'm staying right here, like it or not." Without stopping his stride and not looking towards Susan for a reaction, Jonathan said, "You decided, without asking me or discussing with me, to change the rules of our marriage. You decided on your own that you no longer needed our joint approval or consent to act outside of this marriage." Stopping his pacing momentarily to glare at her, he resumed walking. "Okay, I know you'll say that I don't own your body and what you do with it is your concern. Well, guess what? I say the same. Not only that, I don't feel I need to discuss my future plans with you. You lost that right. Right now, our joint future is the children, nothing more. I don't care what you do with your lover because you're not mine anymore." Susan was shocked by the intensity of his words and his final statement. She gasped and croaked, "Jonathan, please don't tell me you love me so little that this has changed you and us so much. I love you. Please, this doesn't have to be this way." She had not wanted to speak and knew she shouldn't have. Jonathan stopped mid-stride, contemplating her plea, and then turned to her with a face contorted in pain. "Do you know how close love and hate are to each other?" Breaking down, his hands shook, and his legs could no longer support him. He sat down on a stack of wallboard, where just hours earlier he had sat happily with his children. Fighting back tears, he dropped his head, hiding his face from her. "I love you now more than ever, maybe even more than before. But at the same time, I hate you. I hate you more than I have hated anything in my whole life." He looked up at her, his eyes moist and face still twisted with pain and anger. "I hate you for what you've done to me." Susan stood there, covering her ears, her face and expression in shock. She turned and ran up the stairs, sobbing. Jonathan lay down on the wallboard, curling into a fetal position, his mind filled with painful images of her with her lover, images more vivid than any adult movie could be. He whimpered, "Susan, why? Why did you do this to me? I love you." Susan ran to her bedroom, throwing herself onto the bed and sobbing, filled with pain and anguish. She curled into a fetal position, her pain from hearing his words feeling like fire on her skin and acid in her stomach. Her hands still held her ears closed, but his words, "I hate you," echoed repeatedly in her mind. The vision of his anger as he spoke those words echoed in her consciousness. She now knew in her heart, from what he said and how he acted, that he never loved her enough to want to understand why. He never asked her why because it didn't matter, only the fact that she had betrayed him mattered. She wondered if he had ever loved her or merely loved having her. Was it only because she was now involved with another man that she was seen as tainted? For him, there seemed to be no shades of gray, no complexities, just right or wrong, yours or mine. There was no room for anything in between. She cried herself to sleep, realizing that he had never truly loved her and never would. She felt that she had been open to a relationship with Rich, her lover, because intuitively she had known that Jonathan had not truly loved her. Their marriage, she now saw, had been one of convenience for him, devoid of genuine love. Days turned into weeks. Jonathan finished the basement rooms and moved down there with the children. Now that he wasn't working long hours, he spent more time with them. He took them to amusement parks, bought a fifth-wheel camper, and went camping with them. In all these activities, he ensured Susan would not be welcome or present. If she asked to join them, he would either ignore her or ask if she didn't have something better to do. The oddness of his behavior was even beginning to be noticed by the children. They started to feel and act insecure and shy, almost fearful, when both of them were present. When she tried to bring up the subject again, he walked away, refusing to discuss it or them. The only times he spoke about the matter were through a few barbed comments. One day, after they had put the children to bed, she asked him to wait. She had been moody all day. They sat again at the kitchen table. "Jonathan, we've broken up," she said. "He didn't want to be the reason for hurting our marriage anymore. He's moving away. It's over." Jonathan snorted. "And that is supposed to make a difference?" She flinched at his words and the bitterness in them. Despite the weeks that had passed, nothing had changed, only his anger had slowly turned into bitterness. He stood up and asked, "Is that all the news?" Susan sat staring at her hands for a long time before looking up questioningly into his eyes. "Is that all we have to say to each other? Are we that far gone?" He only turned and walked away, down the stairs to his room. Sitting on his bed, anger and a desire to punish her simmered within him. He repeated to himself, "And that is supposed to make a difference?" Life slowly went on, and nothing changed except that Susan became quieter, more thoughtful, and contemplative. Days turned into weeks, and then Christmas and New Year's came and went. That Christmas had a chill, not explainable by the snow on the ground or the howling winds outside. Little Nancy was the first of the children to break under the cold atmosphere. She became irrationally aggressive at times and reclusive at others, avoiding both her parents and clinging almost entirely to her brother. Perhaps because of this, he too seemed to age faster than he actually was. Finally, Cindy, the oldest, began to stay away from home more, getting involved in school activities and friends. One day, as Jonathan came home from work, he found Susan sitting again at the kitchen table, in the furthest corner. The children were once again absent. "Jonathan, there's something we need to talk about," she said, her voice carrying deep sadness and hopelessness. She slid a large manila envelope over the table towards him. "I filed for divorce." Jonathan looked at the envelope, grunted, and nodded. He headed back down to his lair in the basement. As he entered his room, he locked the door behind him. With a sigh that was close to a sob, he sat on his bed, shoulders slumped, head drooping until he cradled it with his hands between his knees. He couldn't make sense of the emotions roiling through him. An almost impenetrable curtain of fear smothered everything. He didn't fear the dissolution of the marriage. He had already faced that when she told him about her year-long affair. It wasn't just sex. No, the fear that turned his insides to water was how he could continue after losing his children. He had thought his life was far better than most, like one of those Norman Rockwell paintings his mother collected. Now it seemed more like one of those pictures for kids where, when you looked carefully, you saw the outline of monsters hidden in the ordinary. Nothing resembled what he'd thought. Susan was like one of those people on TV who pull off a face mask to reveal a different actor. When Susan told him about her lover, his world dissolved, and all he could see were the monsters. Everything he had believed in was gone, except for the kids. He had always believed that if you worked hard, put your family above yourself, and were honest and loyal, you'd achieve the American dream of a wife, 2 kids, and a nice house with a white picket fence. He thought he had all that, but now Susan was going to take it all away. He didn't mind losing the house, he wanted to lose Susan. But what would his life mean without the kids? They were the meaning of life. What happened to you didn't matter, you built for the future, for your kids. Being rid of Susan would be like getting rid of a bad debt. Losing the kids would make him like a new car without an electrical system, pretty and potentially powerful looking on the outside, but useless. It was when she told him what would happen with the kids that his blood turned to stale piss. At one point, he thought about getting DNA tests, a suggestion from a drunken friend. Maybe if they weren't really his kids, he wondered for a moment, it might make it easier. Perhaps he could endure the pain of losing them if they weren't biologically his. But deep down, he knew that the source of the sperm didn't matter, they were his kids, and he would do nothing to damage their relationship with him. If they weren't his, he never wanted them to seek out their real father. These last 6 months had been both the most painful and the most rewarding of his life. Watching Susan, especially when she was leaving or returning from her affair with her unpleasant lover, was tearing him apart inside, much like a turtle with a piranha trapped within its shell. The assault on his manhood was almost unbearable. He had never truly understood the meaning of enduring hate until the last few months. Similarly, he had never grasped the profound relief and joy that spending time with his kids provided. Jonathan constantly berated himself for allowing Susan and her lover to continue their affair, but spending time with his children reinforced his core belief: a real man always puts his duty to his family first. That's what Jonathan had always done in his marriage. He wasn't an articulate man, lacking the pretty words that Susan valued so much, words that her lawyer lover spewed like a broken sewer. For Jonathan, actions spoke louder than words. He worked tirelessly to provide for his family, even though he wasn't particularly adept with books or academia. He knew he could have graduated from a mediocre college, but that wouldn't have equipped him to earn the kind of money he made working in the unair-conditioned heavy equipment shop during Austin's sweltering summers. When a female attorney had advised him that working overtime might increase his alimony payments, he checked his pay history. Over the past 6 years, he had only worked less than 60 hours in a week on 3 occasions. One was when he was in a car accident, which left him with 2 broken ribs and a deflated lung. Despite the pain, he had checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice because they needed to close on land to build their house. The second was when he was sick with a high fever for 3 days. His boss had sent him home, chastising him for spreading the flu. The third instance was when his father died. Even then, he had only taken the minimum time off required to fulfill his obligations as a son at the funeral. Jonathan snorted as he recalled something Susan had recently yelled at him during one of her attempts to justify her infidelity: "You loved your job more than you loved us. You used it to hide from your family and your duties." What a joke. Jonathan had never loved his job. It was hot, sweaty, and dirty in the summer, and cold, sweaty, and grimy in the winter. It wasn't boring, but it wasn't enjoyable either. There was satisfaction in doing it well, and he was very good at it, but he didn't want to spend his free time working on cars. As a result, Jonathan earned more than many middle managers in large corporations. Looking down at his hands, marked with hundreds of scars from the years of labor, he sighed. No one said life was supposed to be easy, but a man did what he had to do for his family. That's what real love was, doing what you needed to do, not what you wanted to do. Jonathan put his head in his hands, trying to hold back tears. He had cried only once, but now tears seemed to be his body's involuntary response to the hollow pain inside him. Unbidden, his mind replayed the harsh words Susan had used the night she shattered his world: "If you divorce me now, Jonathan, I will take you to the cleaners. I will protect my children and me first and foremost. Your welfare will not be a concern of mine. You'll be paying not only child support but also alimony, court costs, my car payment, and for this house. Even with the amount of overtime you've been working, you'd be able to afford nothing but a cardboard box to live in. You'd be sleeping in your car or at work eating Spam and macaroni and cheese for the next 10 to 12 years. If that had been all there was to it, he might have divorced her that week. But it was what she said about losing the kids that troubled him most. Even the attorney he consulted had warned him that joint custody often meant little. The wife might pay lip service to it or even mean it initially, but in her heart, she would likely want a complete home with her new husband replacing her ex as the father. No matter what the court said or what she promised, within a few months, she would start making it increasingly difficult for him to see the kids. It would continue until the children believed their father didn't really want to be with them. He might have trusted the Susan he thought he married, but the monster beneath her skin would probably do everything she could to shut him out of his children's lives. Susan had told him that her lawyer lover had broken up with her because he didn't want to hurt her family, but once she was divorced, she would get him back. She was still a fine-looking woman. Hadn't he read somewhere that even Satan could be beautiful? Susan could certainly give old Beelzebub lessons. Jonathan had done everything he could to make the situation work. He tried to make himself a priority, but he couldn't. His children's happiness was the most important thing in his life, and he felt he had failed there too. His thoughts flashed back to an article in a magazine Susan had accidentally left open. It discussed how much easier it was on children if one parent died rather than if the parents divorced. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Jonathan reached under his mattress and retrieved the pistol he kept for home protection. On autopilot, he removed the trigger lock and placed the gun in his mouth. The barrel was cold and uncomfortable against the roof of his mouth. The metallic click of the hammer hitting an empty chamber startled him so much that he was flung back on the bed. His brain felt like it did when he had been on painkillers in the hospital, slow and fuzzy. It took a long time before he fully grasped what he had almost done. With a snort, Jonathan thought, "I'm even a failure at killing myself." Someone had removed his bullets. Trembling, his whole body was flooded with adrenaline. How could this have happened? He had tried to take the coward's way out. He flashed back to the last time his father had used a belt on him, when he had run away from a schoolyard fight because he was afraid of getting hurt. His father had said that a man would be a fool to seek out a fight, but it was cowardly and foolish to run from a fair one. Listening to your fear will hurt you more in the long run than any knocks or bruises you might get on the schoolyard. Some men never learn that lesson, and some have already ruined their lives by the time they do. Jonathan was determined to learn it now. This was going to hurt more than if he had been beaten today. Next time, he told himself, think and count the cost, but don't listen to your fear. Jonathan had never sought out fights, but he had learned that if he didn't run from them, there were fewer he had to actually confront. Looking at the gun in his hand, he couldn't understand why it wasn't loaded. The gun was for defense, and what good was an unloaded gun? As he loaded it, he thought it might be true that kids are better off with a dead parent than a divorced one, but not with a dead coward. If anyone was going to take a bullet, it ought to be Susan or her lover. The phone rang. "Daddy, did you forget that you promised to help me with my pitches? I tried to tell Mom that I needed your help today if I was going to make the softball travel team, but she said the two of you needed to talk alone. Daddy, please come get me. This is important. If I don't make the club team this year, I'll never be able to make the high school team." Jonathan's whole body was still trembling from the adrenaline rush. A distant part of his mind wondered if his words would be as jumbled as his thoughts. Could he manage a simple hello? Cindy's plea echoed in his head. He had been calling himself ever since Mom dropped them off, and he guessed he had forgotten again. "Please, Daddy, I need you. This is so important." Jonathan's mind was a maelstrom of discordant thoughts, swirling around a core conviction. Someone needed to die, if not him, then Susan or her lover. But a tiny voice wailed that his kids still needed him, no matter how minor the role he might play. Murdering someone else would take him from their lives just as surely as if he had killed himself. He wondered what would have happened to the girls if he had killed himself. What sort of example of a man would he be leaving them? What kind of man would they end up marrying? As he shook his head to clear his thoughts, something in Cindy's tone penetrated. Was it fear? Was she in danger? His daughter was in danger. What kind of man would wallow in his own misery when his daughter needed him? The voice in his head now thundered, proclaiming that a man took care of his family, no matter what it cost him. That was the bedrock of Jonathan's understanding of life. As Cindy continued to make sounds, his mind slowly retreated from the brink of darkness. Trying to clear the chaos in his brain, he shook his head. He couldn't remember promising Cindy to help with her softball practice. It sounded like something he'd do, but softball hadn't seemed that important to her the last time they talked. Jonathan sighed, realizing that not knowing how important the sport was to his 14-year-old daughter was just another sign of his incompetence as a father, a monument to his failure at everything that mattered to him. "Daddy, you're scaring me. Talk to me, please. Daddy, I need you. Daddy, please," Cindy pleaded. Jonathan blinked, and while his body continued to tremble and darkness still beckoned, Cindy's voice held him like a mountain climber's safety line. "I'm sorry, baby. I was distracted for a second. I'll be there to take you to softball practice in just a few minutes. What time does it start? Where are you? Daddy, are you home? Have you seen Mom? Did you talk to her? Did she tell you the questions were too fast, too strange?" All his kids had inherited Susan's brains instead of his. Thank God for that. It made him proud, but sometimes it was hard to follow their nimble skipping from topic to topic. He said, "I'm okay. I was just in my own little world for a bit. I'm heading for you now. I'll be there in less than half an hour. We can talk then. You know I hate to visit on these little phones." It took Jonathan more than half an hour to pull himself together and drive to his daughter. During that time, he figured out that Cindy knew about the divorce. He felt a surge of renewed anger that Susan had taken it upon herself to tell the kids without including him. He was surprised when Cindy told him she had figured out what was happening when she saw a do-it-yourself divorce kit in her mother's room a few days ago. She had been scared but wasn't sure Susan would go through with it until today, when she announced she would leave the girls at Graham's house for at least the night. As Cindy talked, Jonathan saw the pain this mess was causing her. The pain in her eyes felt like deadly icicles piercing his heart. Cindy's plea for him to fight to stay in her life was like body blows to his manhood. In any physical fight, he knew how to protect his vulnerable parts, but he had no defense against the women in his life. Finally, Cindy took his face in her hands and, looking into his eyes, said, "Daddy, I know the courts will probably give us to Mom, but there's another way. Since she doesn't have a lawyer, you can go to a mediator," Cindy had said. "A parent of a friend of mine at school did that, and she said her parents actually get along better now than when they were married. It was so good that they still get together as a family on occasion. Please, Daddy, I got the mediator's name. Please, will you fight for us by taking Mom on about this? Please, Daddy." So now, 2 weeks later, Jonathan found himself seated at a lush conference table with his new lawyer. The walls were covered with trophies. The attorney noticed Jonathan eyeing them and said, "Yes, I've won some big divorce cases. They used several of my cases for moot court at UT Law School. The reason I have those trophies plastered all over the walls in here is to remind both of us what can happen if the collaborative process doesn't work. A few years ago, I tried to sit down with a couple and serve as an arbitrator, but the bar doesn't really like that approach. The danger of my getting sued for conflict of interest is too high. So now I do collaborative law. Your wife will have to find an attorney who has experience in this process, so you will both have advocates. You and your wife will have to sign an agreement never to take any of these issues to court. Then we'll sit down at a table across from each other and hammer out an agreement that will be acceptable for both of you. Of course, either party can withdraw from the agreement not to go to court, but if they do, both lawyers will have to withdraw, and the party that drops out will probably be viewed with some prejudice by the court. The story continues in the next video. Link to part 2 in the description of this video. Thank you for watching and for your likes.